It's essential that we find other frameworks which better explain the structural problems that we have in Scotland. This year's GERS figure puts Scotland's public sector deficit figure at 26.2 billion, up from 21.4 billion the previous year. Now, government deficits are normal, and when the real economy is in such a mess, we need them. There's one day in August every year when everyone is expected to comment on Scotland's macroeconomic position. Independence supporters will highlight that GERS shows the mess that's created in Scotland's economy as part of the United Kingdom, and there is truth in that. The Scottish Government will tell us that GERS is an exercise in calculating Scotland's current position as part of the UK and makes no attempt to predict Scotland's independent economy. This is absolutely true. However, there are things that you're able to strongly infer about independence from the figures in GERS. Various unionist politicians and commentators will focus on the concept of a union dividend that allows Scotland to bask in the benefits of around £2,500 more per person in public expenditure than the rest of the UK, and there is some truth in that. But by extension, they insist that this shows that Scotland cannot afford to be independent, which is nonsense. But it does allow them to make nice, catchy social media graphics. And of course, my good friend Richard Murphy will call GERS crap. This annual stooshy around GERS, which has played out every year since 2013, enabled the heads of the Fraser of Allender Institute and the Scottish Fiscal Commission to write in 2021 that GERS remains a controversial statistical publication on Scotland's public finances. 4 years after those wise words, we are still stuck with the same version of GERS, and by focusing almost exclusively on the size of that headline figure of the government deficit, the paper grabs the headlines for all the wrong reasons. Despite the disagreements around GERS, everyone seems to agree that someone is to blame for Scotland's fiscal deficit, which increased by £5 billion this year. Now, I'm doing this short video to call for an end to the blame game and encourage everyone to embrace fiscal deficits in Scotland. We need one now, and should we become independent again, we will need our government to deficit spend, and spend big, every single year. As Scotland's foreign sector, and for Scotland's sectorial balances, that includes the rest of the United Kingdom, it runs a surplus, and assuming that we want to have a private sector surplus to be enjoyed by Scottish households and businesses, this is generally agreed to be a good idea, there must be a government deficit. Some other part of the economy must provide the surplus for the sectorial balances to balance. As the UK government is a currency issuer, that deficit must come from the creation of new government liabilities that you know as debt, and only the UK can do this. So let me say this more clearly. If we want to have net private sector savings in Scotland, the only government that can provide these assets for the Scottish private sector is the UK government. As part of the United Kingdom, deficit spending can only be done by the currency issuer, which is the UK government. Now, this statement is explained by a macroeconomic framework that I've mentioned already called sectorial balances. Sectorial balances help us see both sides of a government deficit. As every financial liability is an asset for someone, sectorial balances show both sides of a country's balance sheet. Now, in September, we will launch Scotland's sectorial balances. There's a link in the show notes to subscribe to the mailing list to receive those sectorial balances. Now, the St. Louis Fed records the US sectorial balances, and it's clear when you look at any set of sectorial balances that deficits on one side must equal surpluses on the other. Now, I've put a link to the Fed database in the show notes. In Scotland, every year since at least 1998, the government deficit has reduced the private sector deficit or has put the private sector into surplus. Assume for one moment that all or three levels of government ran a balanced budget in Scotland and nothing else changed. Now, this is something that every mainstream politician would agree is a good idea, and many economic commentators in Scotland would likely agree too. Maybe you might even think that. So what would this mean? Well, this would likely mean a 10% fall in government spending. Now, you can reduce the deficit by increasing taxes, but as the government can't control the amount it collects as easily as the amount it spends, governments tend to choose to cut spending. Either way, reducing spending or increased taxation delivers austerity. At the height of the austerity between 2010 and 2015, overall government spending shrank by around 2%. So imagine what 5 times that level of austerity would feel like in Scotland. Now, if you bemoan the public sector deficit, You must embrace austerity. A balanced government budget would mean a massive austerity programme of the size that was forced on Greece in the early 2010s in Scotland. Without government deficits, considering that the foreign sector runs a surplus, it would be the Scottish private sector, that's you and me, that would have to fill the gap. It would be more financial wealth from the non-government sector in Scotland that heads abroad. Now, the sectorial balance is an accounting identity, which means it's not an economic opinion, but an accounting fact. The government balance, plus the foreign balance, plus the private sector balance, which is also known as the domestic non-government sector, must equal zero. In short, owing to the makeup of the Scottish economy, we need that public sector deficit to be close to 10% of GDP to allow us to net save some of our income and pay the surplus to the foreign sector. Now, tracking sectorial balances helps policymakers understand how different parts of the economy, households, businesses, government and the rest of the world interact, and it makes it easier to design policies that support a sustained and balanced economy. It certainly pushes every government away from disastrous and crazy fiscal rules. Perhaps even more importantly, it allows the public to see the clear relationship between government deficits, surpluses and our own private wealth. In Scotland, it tells a story that GERS just avoids. So what is the real story? Well, that comes from analysing Scotland's sectorial balances. And it's not the level of government deficit, but the amount of untaxed financial wealth that leaves Scotland and heads to the rest of the UK and overseas. This is principally returned to investors outside of Scotland as profit on their investments. Now, net income flows alone account for almost 5% of Scotland's total GDP and almost half of the total of the government deficit. None of this is covered in GERS. Instead, by using this neoliberal mainstream lens, it supports the idea that Scotland's fiscal deficit is a concern for the present and the future. But as I've exposed, the public deficit is simply responding to the other two sectors of the economy. If we want the private sector to net save, and the foreign sector has such a large surplus, the corresponding deficit can only come from the UK government when it creates new net financial assets through government spending. The current structure of the Scottish economy ensures that this public deficit is essential. And this would be the starting position for an independent Scotland. By chastising governments for ensuring the private sector net saves, we've created a dystopian world where we criticise governments for doing the thing that they were created to do, to provide us with the means to prosper. Now, the UK and the Scottish Government must focus on the leakage of financial assets from Scotland, but this is a monumental and complicated task. It's much easier just to focus on the public deficit and argue about which government contributes more or less to that deficit. Now, in response to GERS, Scotland's Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government, Shona Robinson, said revenues are in fact increasing at a higher level than expenditure for those devolved areas. But unless that revenue is coming from the foreign sector, which it isn't, if the Scottish Government spends less than it collects, it will shrink the private sector's net wealth. Does anyone really want to vote for a government that does that? So the commentary and the public discussion and the Cabinet Secretary's comments expose the need for other frameworks that explain the dynamics of Scotland's economy. Now, GERS is a useful publication, and by highlighting the size of the public deficit, it should enable us to structurally alter Scotland's economy. But instead, it just leads to the blame game. Now, please support our call for the Scottish Government to collect sectorial balances data and release that alongside the next GERS figures. You can do that by signing up to the link in the show notes. It's essential that we find other frameworks which better explain the structural problems that we have in Scotland and across the United Kingdom.